Number 5. The Lighthouse. From visionary director Robert Eggers comes The Lighthouse, a harrowing fable that teaches us the importance of respecting personal boundaries and respecting seabirds. Eggers is one of my favorite modern horror directors, whose work sits a cut above the most usual horror fare with The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, which isn't quite horror unless you're terrified of Norway. The Lighthouse is unlike any other scary movies you've seen. Actually, it's probably unlike most movies you've seen. It's kinda hard to define The Lighthouse under one genre. It's unsettling and definitely makes me feel all heebly-jeebly watching it, but it isn't horror in the traditional sense. There's no monsters or slashers, just two men, a lighthouse, a whole lot of seagulls, and enough cabin fever-induced madness to shake a lobster at. A rookie lighthouse keeper, played by Robert Pattinson, is assigned to keep a lighthouse on a small isolated island off the coast of New England, under the supervision of the island's crusty old master, Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson are some of the best working actors out there right now, and the two of these titans absolutely show up for this, carrying this two-headed character piece on their backs and speaking in some of the most hilariously memorable accents ever put to film. Seriously, Willem Dafoe's old nautical piratical accent in this thing needs to be taught in acting schools. I would do an impression, but I won't do it justice. The film is shot beautifully, the whole thing seeming like a mix between a bad dream and an avant-garde theater production, leaving you asking the entire time if anything you're seeing can be trusted, if any of it's even happening, or if the whole thing is all just one twisted nightmare between two very lonely, isolated men. Now, I can't say for sure if they went nuts because they weren't subscribed to Top 5 Scary, but I'm willing to bet that a little bit of entertainment from the best scary videos channel on the web might have helped some of that madness. So subscribe, maybe. Number 4. Annihilation. I've talked a bit about Annihilation before on this channel, and I will continue to do so until Annihilation gets the respect it deserves. That's my mission. I've never forgiven the movie-going populace for not seeing this one in theaters. Annihilation came to us from director and writer Alex Garland, who also gave us Ex Machina, a fantastic movie about having a crush on a robot. Annihilation is a cosmic horror story detailing the effects of after an asteroid crashes to Earth and a mysterious alien presence known as the Shimmer begins to manifest across a quarantine zone in a forest outside an army base. Everything the Shimmer touches starts to blend together, biological life merging, double helixes swirling in a big cosmic gumbo. The film is hauntingly beautiful as it is terrifying. Our protagonist Lena, played by Natalie Portman, is a US Army veteran who lost her husband in an unrelated combat mission. One day he shows up on her doorstep, convulsing violently, leading Lena towards the Shimmer. Learning her husband was involved, she ventures forth with a group of fellow researchers and soldiers to uncover what lies at the heart of the Shimmer, what's causing it, and if it can be stopped. The film is a visual treat with its lush vistas and uniquely terrifying monster designs. I've talked about Annihilation Bear before, and I will take any opportunity to talk about Annihilation Bear. I love Annihilation Bear. Slap a photo of him back there for me. Annihilation is the perfect kind of horror movie, simultaneously exploring complex themes of depression, grief, humanity's inherent nature and propensity towards self-destructive behavior, but it also asks even bigger questions like, wouldn't it be really yucky if a bear had a human skull inside its head that screamed like a dying human while it was roaring? Get you a horror movie that can do both, okay? Number 3. Jacob's Ladder. While the first two entries on our list were pretty recent and well received, I want to throw it back a couple decades for our next entry and highlight a cult classic that could always use a little bit more love. Jacob's Ladder details the story of Jacob Singer, a Vietnam veteran who 4 years later, after returning home from the war, struggles to readjust to his normal life. Not helping matters much, no doubt, is the fact that Jacob keeps seeing horrifying monstrosities surrounding him every day. It seems as if since he's come home, nothing has ever been the same. The film shows us life through Jacob's tormented eyes. As he tries to navigate through healing and overcoming his personal demons, he is constantly haunted by real-life demons that seem to have a very vested interest in him. Matters only serve to get a lot more confusing when Jacob learns that other members of his platoon, back from his army days, have all been suffering similar things, reporting seeing the same monsters and being haunted. Desperate to find the truth, Jacob seeks out the cause of what's happening to him and his old friends, and ends up descending down a path of madness, learning things no man ever should. Worth noting is just how influential Jacob's Ladder is, serving as one of the direct inspirations for the legendary Silent Hill series of games, with Silent Hill 2 in particular taking major inspiration from the film's plotline, monsters, twists, right down to the protagonists even wearing the exact same outfit as a little homage. Jacob's Ladder is a little older than some of the other entries on this list. It is absolutely worth a watch and still worth your time. A great performance out of Tim Robbins and one of the most wild twist ending horror movies ever had. A bunch have tried to copy this. I'm sure you've seen a million hack writers copy it, but no one did it as cool as when Jacob's Ladder did it, so there. And actually thinking about it, I shouldn't even mention a twist, so There was no twist. Everything in Jacob's Ladder happens very literally. Go into it knowing that, okay? Number 2, Sinister. Moving. It's always stressful, isn't it? It's a huge pain. Well, Sinister is a 2012 horror film about an everyday family moving houses and all the trials and tribulations that come with that, like having to update your postal code on your information, unpacking your stuff and figuring out where all your art books are gonna go, and finding out that you moved into a house where a series of grisly rituals happened, sacrificing the previous family who lived here, and it's all been filmed and kept in a box upstairs in the attic. You know, just regular stuff the kids go through all the time. A struggling true crime novelist is trying to chase his glory days and intentionally moves into a house he knows where ghastly deaths took place in order to get close to the story so he can better research it and write a bestseller. He discovers a box in the attic full of film of all of the crimes and becomes obsessed with uncovering and exposing what happened, mostly so he can make a quick buck and get himself back on top again and make the late night circuit. As his obsession grows, it starts to affect his family and children in concerning ways, as everyone in the family starts acting stranger, having visions, hallucinations, and psychotic episodes, leaving you wondering if there is something much deeper going on in this house beyond a floundering author chasing a bestseller. Now, if you haven't seen this one, it's definitely worth going into this one as blind as you possibly can, because the twists and turns totally make this one. I spent the entire runtime of this propped up on the edge of the couch, my heart pounding, hoping that everything would turn out to be totally okay, even though I knew better. It's a horror movie, things never go great. The movie's got a stellar sense of dread that refuses to let go once it starts, and only lets you breathe out once the credits roll, and even then, not for very long. Fantastic performances across the board, but a special shout out goes to Ethan Hawke, who makes this thing. Number 1, Hereditary. Now, there are a ton of movies that could easily have taken the number 1 spot here, and I thought pretty hard about making The Shining number 1, since, you know, it's kind of a classic, but I figured a lot of people have talked about The Shining, and then I remembered the experience of seeing Hereditary in a movie theater, and how it was the only time in my life I've ever seriously thought about leaving a movie theater because I thought I was gonna throw up on the seats. I was so scared and uncomfortable. Hereditary is a 2018 horror movie from visionary Ari Aster, who also gave us the psychological horror movie masterpiece Midsommar, so Aster really just bangs out the hits. Hereditary is about as peak A24 horror movie as it gets. One of those ones where the monster is really a metaphor for generational trauma and all that. After the grand matriarch of a Midwestern family passes away, her daughter and grandkids begin to uncover the cryptic and terrifying truth behind their ancestry, trying desperately to escape the sinister legacy they've inadvertently inherited. This movie is terrifying in the worst of ways. It's not just jump scares or tons of blood. No. This is elevated horror. This is not your usual horror story. It really zeroes in on the way too close to home horror of watching a family break apart. It is gut-wrenchingly painful to watch, preying on really specific kind of fears. It's gonna get its hooks in you and have your teeth grinding for the full 2 hours runtime and for ages afterwards. If you've seen this, I dare you to look at a pigeon, a stop sign, cheese wire, or a treehouse ever the same after this movie. And staggering performances. Toni Collette goes for absolute gold and delivers one of the best performances I've ever seen in a horror movie, full stop. She needs an Oscar for most upsetting crying I have ever heard in a film, which is a category she would have no competition in. Hereditary might not be the goriest film or even the scariest movie I've ever seen or most upsetting. There's a bunch of Takashi Miike or Park Chan-wook films that would probably take that. But Hereditary is definitely one of the most viscerally scary movies I've ever seen. The kind that just sits in your gut and makes you think about it all day, like you were living through an actual nightmare. Watch only if you're truly brave. I know I made it sound absolutely horrible, but it is a great movie. Just don't be surprised if you don't sleep that night.
Kicking off at number 5, Session 9, 2001.
I know this is difficult, Mary, and that's why we're here to help, okay?
I miss Peter.
And for a list that is filled to the brim with some of the most monumental works of horror cinema, a few of you may stand aghast at me placing 2001's Session 9 on this list, but I'd say that's exactly the point. If you've ever heard about how good Session 9 is, particularly when it comes to psychological horror, but never had the gumption to go out and watch it, consider this your warning sign. Session 9 is a fantastic horror film, and as so far as psychological horror goes, it's up there with some of the best of the best. Now, I'm a bit of a stickler for for tying things off in neat little packages, and believe me when I say this, Session 9 has one of the best final lines of dialogue in the whole of horror cinema. Obviously, no spoilers, but yeah, it's good. Now, whilst we've covered Session 9 quite a few times over here at Top 5 Scary Videos, I appreciate that not everyone has had the pleasure of seeing it, so let's see what all the fuss is about. Written and directed by Brad Anderson, the man responsible for 2004's The Machinist, which is also a fantastic psychological thriller that falls slightly outside the realm of horror, Session 9 was a complete flop at the box office, but hey, that's the reason why we can now adore it from a distance. Session 9 tells a tale of Gordon, the grizzled old owner of an asbestos removal company, who takes a desperate bid to clear out Danvers State Hospital, an abandoned mental institution, and we all know how that usually goes, right? Well, the thing is, whilst on the surface Session 9 seems to be a relatively standard staple of horror, this film is so damn surprising in its delivery that not only is it genuinely terrifying, it's also a joy to watch something so fresh that also covers some incredibly important themes. Peter Mullen, who plays Gordon in this film, also knocks Session 9 out of the park. He's fantastic, and the weight of his performance really turns up the slow claustrophobic descent into chaos. I'll say no more because there are spoilers abound for Session 9, but yeah, it truly deserves its place here. Swinging in at number 4, Misery, 1990.
Oh, you bought the wrong paper, Annie. I can't write on this paper, Annie. Well, I'll get your stupid paper, but you just better start showing me a little more appreciation around here, Mr. Man.
Oh, Annie Wilkes, you bought the wrong paper, Annie. You terrifying nurse of a person. A nursin. Sorry, I'm trying to distract myself, because really, if you've seen any of our previous Stephen King lists, you'll know the deep-seated fear I have for this character in particular. If only he got out of the cock-a-doodle car. Or, well, he probably should have stayed in it, in all reality, and waited for it to burst into flames, so he'd quickly be put out of his misery. Hey, would you look at that? We've come full circle. The point is, it goes without saying that 1990's Misery deserves its place here. And you might be thinking, number 4, wow, that's pretty low. But no, it's a testament to the rest of the entries on this list. But when it comes to psychological horror, you really have to go the distance. But that's not to detract from anything about Misery though, and if we're talking about performance alone, then there is perhaps no greater cinematic depiction of a psychopath. Yeah, Misery is nothing without Kathy Bates. They go together like Rama Lama Lama Cat Dinga Da Ding Da Dong. They're two peas in a pod, and whilst for the astute amongst you, I may have made that joke before, the point remains the same. Hey, I feel like I'm irking on psychological horror trying to describe this damn movie, which may be pretty illuminating to how horrific it is. Directed by Rob Reiner with a screenplay from none other than William Goldman, based upon the resounding 1987 Stephen King novel of the same name, Misery tells the tale of a renowned novelist, Paul Sheldon, fantastically portrayed by James Caan, who is caught in a blizzard whilst travelling back to New York one evening and then gets hurtled off the road in a horrifying car accident. Luckily for him though, he's rescued by a nurse, Annie Wilkes, who lives nearby and offers him shelter in her remote home. And luckily for him, it just so turns out that Annie Wilkes is his #1 fan. Yeah, I need to say any more about Misery, because if you haven't seen it, or read it for that matter, stop what you're doing right this minute and get to it. Next up at number 3, Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Yeah, here we go. Jacob's Ladder, everybody, and believe me, that clip is on the tamer side of what's left to rear its ugly, horrifying, psychologically traumatizing head. In many ways, Jacob's Ladder is the living definition of psychological horror, and since its release back in 1990, it's stuck out like a sore thumb in the catalogue of horror. For the most part, there hasn't ever been a film made quite like Jacob's Ladder, and that's mainly down to Tim Robbins' absolutely mesmerizing performance as Jacob Singer, an American combat medic that has returned from the Vietnam War with a box of horrors of his own to deal with. The psychological implications of witnessing the horrors of the Vietnam War aside, what Jacob's Ladder manages to do is put us in the headspace of someone experiencing a descent into madness. And whilst that sounds like a relatively straightforward staple of horror, and it is, it's also really difficult to do wow. Jacob's Ladder doesn't just do it wow, it's perhaps the greatest cinematic depiction of one man's life spiraling out of control. This film is devastating, it's bleak, and for those of you that haven't yet seen it, I'll try my utmost to keep a lid on things. Written by Bruce Joel Rubin and directed by Adrian Lin, the man behind the fantastic 1987 thriller Fatal Attraction, Jacob's Ladder tells the tale of Jacob Singer, a US combat medic that is injured in the Vietnam War, where he returns to his native city of New York to attempt to live a normal life again after inexplicably grieving about the things that he's lost. As he deals with these emotions, Jacob begins to experience horrifying visions of a world desperately trying to consume him. Now, listen, the visuals in this film are something else entirely, and they go on to influence some of the greatest works works of video game horror, as in the Silent Hill franchise, and that may be a little bit spoilerific, so I'll stop there. If you haven't yet seen Jacob's Ladder, it really is a movie deserving of its hype. It's harrowing, it's desperate, it's bleak, it's a film that you need to be hugged afterwards. It's emotionally draining, both on and off the screen. I'll say no more, Jacob's Ladder is one of the greatest psychological horror movies ever made. Coming in at number 2, Funny Games, 2007.
Cock it. Pull the hammer back.
And yes, I'm including both the 1997 and 2007 versions of this film for reasons that we'll get into shortly, but if you're asking me, I think the 2007 version of this film is the slightly better portrayal, and it just so happens to be one of my favourite horror movies of all time, although it does leave out some of the more harrowing scenes depicted in the original, and believe me, that really is saying something. But hey, personal bias aside, Funny Games is one of the greatest psychological horror movies ever made. Period. And the reason that I'm recommending both is that the latter is a shot-for-shot remake from the same filmmaker, the resounding Austrian director Michael Haneke. Now, we could talk about the cultural connotations of this film all day. We could talk about how Funny Games is a stark representation of violence in media, and we could talk about how the whitewash cinematography perfectly opposes the chaotic nature of modern society, which is remarkably captured in our previous clip, but hey, that's a conversation for a different time. Maybe. For me, the criticism for this film is hilarious. Haneke wrote an entire essay on how his intention for this film was to ultimately serve a pointless narrative. And what were the critics' response? This film is unimaginative and pointless. Yeah, I'll say no more. Written and directed by Michael Haneke, Funny Games tells the tale of a husband and wife alongside their young son who arrive in their lake house for vacation when two young men approach on a small rowing boat and ask to borrow some eggs. That's all I'll say. This film is bleak, this film is horrifying, this film messes with your head, but therein lies the point of it. Also, the way that Funny Games deals with the fourth wall is a breath of fresh air, and it's what elevates this film from senseless violence to a piece of cinema that actually has something to say. Also, in the 2007 version, Michael Pitt, who plays Paul, is phenomenal, and if you're asking me, delivers one of the most remarkable performances in modern horror cinema. Yeah, there we have it. Funny Games. There is nothing funny about it. Watch it. And finally, coming in at the number 1 spot, The Silence of the Lambs, 1991.
Good evening, gentlemen.
The fact of the matter remains, we can't make a list based on psychological horror without giving the top spot to the undisputed king of cerebral horror machinations, Dr. Hannibal Lecter himself. Pound for pound, this is perhaps one of the greatest horror thrillers ever made. Fact. We all know it, there is no denying it. And whilst it's mainly down to the fact that Sir Anthony Hopkins delivers an out-of-this-world performance as one of the most complex characters of horror ever written, it's also down to the fact that The Silence of the Lambs doesn't rely on artistry to bring the psychological horror, but instead, it simply documents it. It plays out the story of Buffalo Bill, Lecter and Clarice Starling, and then it goes. There are no mind-bending assaults of the brain, there is nothing lurking within the cinematography that throws us off guard. It is simply a story and a performance. And for a film to be as impactful as it is without resting on its laurels, we have to take note that there simply aren't many movies like this anymore. Directed by Jonathan Demme and based upon the fantastic novel of the same name by Thomas Harris, The Silence of the Lambs tells the tale of FBI trainee Clarice Starling, who is mysteriously assigned to interview Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a former psychiatrist and imprisoned cannibalistic serial killer whose unique perspective of the human mind is needed to hunt down another psychopathic serial killer, Buffalo Bill, a murderer responsible for killing young women and then skinning them. Listen, there are no places to hide with this film. From the off, we descend into a world of psychological conflict, a world where sharks hunt sharks. But put it this way, despite its horrific content, The Silence of the Lambs is one of the few horror films to win an Academy Award. Not just 1, but 5, including Best Actor, Best Picture, and Best Actress for the phenomenal Jodie Foster. And whilst I usually don't exactly care for the Oscars, this one is as deserving as they come. The Silence of the Lambs is perhaps the finest story of psychological horror ever captured on screen. It's number 1 every single day, and now I wish I would have worn my Silence of the Lambs t-shirt. Damn.
Coming in at number 5, we have The Killing of a Sacred Deer. Released in 2017 and directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, The Killing of a Sacred Deer stars Colin Farrell and Nicole Kidman and follows a cardiac surgeon, Colin Farrell, who secretly befriends a teenage boy with a connection to his past. He introduces the boy to his family, who then begin to fall mysteriously ill. Now, director Lanthimos is renowned for making incredibly uncomfortable and distressing movies, entering Killing of the Sacred Deer with Dogtooth and The Lobster under his belt. However, Killing of a Sacred Deer seems to be the most most distressing. The relationship formed between Colin Farrell and the teenage boy is wildly uncomfortable and awkward, making you want to shield your eyes away from anything happening on screen. However, before we know it, awkwardness turns into horror, with the teenage boy Steven demanding a sacrifice. The movie digs deep under your skin and plays out in a deadpan and absurd way, just like the rest of his movies do. It descends so quickly into madness that you can't quite keep up, and things are soon the stuff of nightmares. It is almost impossible to describe the effect Killing of a Sacred Deer has on the psyche, but it lingers with no desire to leave. Coming in at number 4, we have Funny Games. Directed by Michael Haneke and released in 1997, Funny Games is a psychological Austrian horror movie that revolves around two young men who hold a family hostage and torture them with sadistic games in their vacation home. The movie puts you as the viewer through the ringer, along with the rest of the family. It feels like the director is calling us out for seeking such a disturbing movie, and in turn kidnapping us and taking us along for the ride. The film frequently blurs the lines between fiction and reality, and actively highlights the act of observation, making you, the viewer, feel like the villain. The movie wants to hold you, the viewer, responsible for your taste in violence, and in turn taking us captive along the way. The character Paul frequently breaks the fourth wall throughout, and even addresses the camera in certain scenes. On top of that, Paul frequently states his intentions to follow the standards of film plot development, and shows awareness of the audience's expectations, even asking us questions throughout. It's a movie that is as self-aware as they come. It feels like a reality show that you have the control over. After all, you have the remote, you can end this at any moment, but you don't, and the director knows that you won't. So the characters continue to call you out, while inflicting torture on the innocent family. The movie is truly pure genius, and if you haven't yet, I suggest you check it out immediately. Also, the same director did an American remake starring Naomi Watts. It's very good, just as good. Coming in at number 3, we need to talk about Kevin. Directed by Lynn Ramsey and released in 2011, We Need to Talk About Kevin is a psychological thriller horror starring Tilda Swinton, a travel writer / publisher who gives up her freedom and bohemian lifestyle to have a child with her husband. However, pregnancy doesn't seem to agree with her, but what's worse is when she does give birth, it is to a baby boy named Kevin who she just can't seem to bond with. Worse still, when Kevin grows up, he becomes a sociopathic teenager who commits a horrific act. Now, the movie is absolutely haunting and earth-shattering, and it takes on one of the most disturbing and upsetting issues in contemporary America: school shootings. Jumping through time and memory, We Need to Talk About Kevin showcases the relationship between Eva and Kevin, and her unraveling psyche, which begins to turn on itself. From start to finish, the movie is an onslaught of mental torment, as we watch on as Kevin grows into a teenager and the hideous deeds he commits. The film is incredibly tough to swallow, and throughout, watching feels like you might be drowning along with the characters. It's a haunting piece of work that you can't quite enjoy, but you can commend for being so visceral and impactful. You never get the answers you seek while watching the movie. Instead, it seems to be actively denying you any kind of resolution, and when the credits roll, you feel completely drained of emotion and tormented by what you just saw. Proceed with caution. I honestly don't think I could watch it again. Once was enough. In at number 2, we have Session 9. I've discussed this movie countless times on this channel now, but I will keep pushing it until the day I die, because this horror movie is pure excellence. Trust. Directed by Brad Anderson and released in 2001, Session 9 is a psychological horror that follows an asbestos abatement crew who begin to experience growing tensions while working in an abandoned mental asylum. This is paralleled by the gradual revelation of a former patient's disturbed past through recorded audio tapes of her regression sessions. Now, Session 9 is an incredibly effective slow burn of a horror movie that seeps under your skin and won't necessarily leave after the credits roll. Now, each one of the crew members have their own dark secrets that begin to unravel the deeper into the asylum they go. When one of the team members begins to listen to the haunting tapes of a patient who suffered from severe multiple personality disorder, things begin to descend into madness and become increasingly chilling. The asylum is dingy in the movie lo-fi, making everything appear gritty and uncomfortable. The movie is moody and incredibly atmospheric, and instead of focusing on jump scares, focuses on the horrors of the mind. If you have yet to check out Session 9, you certainly should. From start to finish, you are sucked in and isolated inside the asylum with the crew. And not to mention, it has one hell of an ending that makes you question how you didn't see it coming in the first place. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Jacob's Ladder. Released in 1990 and directed by Adrian Lyne, Jacob's Ladder is a horror film starring Tim Robbins that tells the story of protagonist Jacob, a soldier during the Vietnam War whose experiences prior to and during combat result in strange, fragmentary visions and bizarre hallucinations that continue to haunt him. As his ordeal worsens, Jacob desperately attempts to figure out the truth. Now, this movie is a combination of many things. It is one part war movie, one part political thriller, and another part emotional torment. Throughout the movie, Jacob is trapped in a reoccurring nightmare from the war, as well as struggling with the grief over the death of his young son. He begins to lose his grasp on reality while battling an ongoing suspicion that he may already be in hell. From the director of Fatal Attraction, Jacob's Ladder, from start to finish, there's an intense grip on us and our psyche, with us not quite knowing what is real and what isn't. From people with no faces and subways with no exits, what exactly is happening, or is it all merely existing in Jacob's mind? Throughout the movie, he attempts to unravel his traumatic past while also suffering from severe case of disassociation. From start to finish, the movie is a nerve-wracking roller coaster ride, only you're constantly falling with no end in sight. All Jacob wants is peace, and all we want is to know what the heck is going on. Some interesting information for all you horror lovers out there: it was actually Jacob's Ladder that inspired the horror franchise Silent Hill, including the video games and film adaptation.